Okay, I want to ask you a question. Do you want to be happy? Do you want to experience joy in your life? Right? And I mean, do you want to have people that you know, your friends and relatives, do you want them to be happy and experience joy? And I think all of us would say, yes, I want that. I want joy in my life. I want more joy. I want depth of joy. But the question would be, what is joy? And what does it mean to live a life of joy? How do you get at that? And so for the next couple of weeks, starting today, we're going to be talking about joy and what it means to live a life of joy. And we're going to be going to Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of John and looking at what that joy means and how we can live into it and understand it, live it fully. Because I'm convinced that the way of Jesus is a way of joy, that he wants us to live a joyful life. That's his will for us. Now, I've been thinking about joy for a little while now because I think most of you know about 7 months ago, back in January, we traded the possibility of a good night's sleep for this little bundle of joy. We welcomed this little person into our family, and so here we are 7 months later, kind of with this squirmy little person, right, who babbles and scoots across the floor and cries and needs all of our attention. And we get a lot of joy from this guy, but it's not all fun. And sometimes our hearts are in our throats, and sometimes we're just worrying and we're exhausted. And we've been given this little gift and this little person, and as the doctor who delivered him said, well, he's yours forever, which is kind of something that humbles you, right? But it reminds me, when I think about our experience, and many of you have had that experience, or have nieces or nephews or neighbors, and many of you have had this experience, that the experience of joy is not always straightforward. And maybe it never is, right? In fact, joy can strike out of the blue, and it will be bundled with this confusing mix of emotions. And sometimes, like the late, great Orthodox priest Alexander Schmemann puts it, sometimes joy will come to us as a bright sorrow. Now, Jesus talked about joy. And Jesus said in John 15 that he desires his disciples, which really is all of us by extension, he desires his disciples to live in joy. He says, I'm teaching you all this so that your joy may be complete, which is really kind of a surprising thing for Jesus to be saying at this point in his ministry, because just then, if we're paying attention, just then the context is such that Jesus is teaching in the upper room, and he knows that in that same evening, he will be betrayed, he will be arrested, he will go to have the sham trial, he will be crucified the next day. And here he is with his disciples in the upper room, those 12 disciples, his closest students and friends. And he's talking to them during the Jewish festival of Passover. They've shared this meal together, and he says, I want your joy to be complete. And it's sort of this strange juxtaposition, right? The coming sorrowful destiny. And maybe they don't understand it completely, but he does. And this idea of joy. Right, they've shared this meal together, and the high point was when he gave them the bread. He told them he's the new Passover lamb, that he is the new cup of salvation. And here he's saying, I want your joy to be complete. He says, nobody has a greater love than this, than laying down his life for his friends. He's saying, I'm going to die, and I want your joy to be complete. He's saying, I want you, my students, you, my followers, live this joyful life. And there's potentially something strange about that, or it can feel strange, right? This incongruence. And I mean, it'd be natural for Jesus, who knows that he's going to die on the cross soon. It would be natural for him to talk about self-sacrifice, right? In some ways, that'd make more sense. And he has talked about sacrifice at other points in his ministry. Jesus says, listen, if you want to follow me, take up your cross and follow me. Give something up. He says, look, following me is serious. You've got to count well the costs. He says you've got to decide to do it. This is not something you can just slide into. He says, don't put your hand to the plow and turn back. He says, follow me wholeheartedly. It's this sacrificial way. The cross and self-sacrifice are part of Jesus' teaching. And it's kind of like, though, here, in this moment that you can imagine would really be this tense moment, this difficult moment, this moment charged with fear and meaning, that Jesus didn't want them to forget about joy. The cross is hovering on the horizon. They can feel that this destiny is plodding towards them. And it's this moment where Jesus does not want them to lose sight of joy. It's verse 11, where he says, I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Now then again, we really shouldn't be too surprised that Jesus is talking about joy just then. I mean, his aim all along has been that his followers would live a full and abundant life. He said back in chapter 10 that he's come so that everyone who comes to him may live this abundant life. He was the teacher of life, right? Everything that he's teaching is eminently practical. Right? And if you pay attention to what he's teaching, to what Jesus is modeling, you'll realize he's not just teaching a way of sacrifice, but this whole way of life. Right? This way of life that is work and play, family, community, mercy, justice, it's all in there. And yes, sacrifice, but that is just because no truly human life can happen without some sense of sacrifice. But so too joy is in there. And Jesus teaches joy. His way is a way of joy. And I think Jesus talks about joy right then in that tense moment because that's what's important to him. He knows his time is short. He knows that he will soon be betrayed, and he doesn't want him to miss it. He's saying, look, there's not much time left. Listen up. This is a way of joy. My life is a way of joy. Choose this way of joy that I'm showing you. And so too, maybe the reason Jesus talks about joy here in the shadow of the cross is because and so often in the world, so often in our lives, joy is bundled with other experiences that we have, right? Sorrow and pain we experience that, and then somehow just like right smack dab in the middle of all that, in the middle of loss, just plop, joy. And it's this moment where I think we'll often catch ourselves and say, where did that come from? And Jesus is saying that this is the way that it's always going to be when we experience joy. That there will be this bittersweet edge to it, that the cross and the Savior go together, that sorrow and love come mingling down. And this tells us something about the nature of joy. Because you see, joy isn't an emotion that we can manufacture. In my experience, joy always feels like it comes from outside of us. As C.S. Lewis points out, he says, joy is never in our power, but pleasure often is. And this is why, as Lewis notes, pleasure can become this kind of substitute for joy. Which isn't to say that pleasures, like, the pleasure of eating something good, the pleasure of doing something we love, the pleasure of sleeping, the pleasure of relaxing, whatever that is, right? It's not to say those aren't real or authentic or necessary. I mean, they are definite goods in and of themselves, but there's a reason we call them enjoyment. Because of the way they give us joy. But I think what he's saying is that joy, in the sense that Jesus is talking about it, is something that is more than happiness or pleasure. Because however good happiness and pleasure are, joy has a kind of depth to it. And there's this mysterious element to joy. And it's not least mysterious in the way that we can experience both joy and sorrow at the same time. And you see this in the way that joy is used throughout the Bible. So King Solomon in the Old Testament, there's this moment, it says that Solomon ate, he's made king, and the people ate and drank before the Lord on that day with great joy. Or the prophet Jeremiah, this prophet who said, I don't even want to talk about you anymore, God, because you always get me in trouble. But the prophet says that the words of God, nevertheless, they were a joy and a delight to his heart. Or Nehemiah, who's got all this struggle going on, right? Trying to build the walls of Jerusalem. And he says, the joy of the Lord is my strength. Or if you go to the Apocrypha in Sirach, the fear of the Lord delights the heart and gives gladness and joy and long life. And Romans, in the New Testament, Paul says that the kingdom of God is not food or drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. And this, though Paul is someone who consistently was going through tremendous suffering and was sometimes incarcerated and had to write his letters that touch on the theme of joy from a place of potential deep depression. There's this line running through the scriptures, through God's people old and new, that to live with God is a life of joy. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus actually mentions joy 7 times, which, 7 times, that's got to be John's little way of giving us a signal that's saying that Jesus completes joy, that Jesus brings the biblical teaching of joy to its fullness. Because 7 in the scriptures is always this number of completeness. It's this number of perfection. So anytime you see the number 7 in the Bible, and especially in John's writings, you got to kind of pause and ask yourself, all right, what's he getting at? What's he signaling with that? And so in the Gospel of John, there's these multiple 7s, right? There's 7 I am statements, and there's 7 miraculous signs that Jesus gives. And here Jesus talks about joy 7 times. So I think there's this idea that if you want to understand joy, John's kind of signaling this, if you want to understand joy, then Jesus is going to be your go-to guy. Then Jesus is going to be your teacher. He's going to show you the complete way of joy. If you're going to get a little closer to the well of joy, the fullness of joy, then you have to get a little bit closer to Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but that is something that I aspire to live into, this fullness of joy. I want to have that completeness of joy that Jesus is talking about. And I bet you do too. But the question is, how? And we have to look at what Jesus taught here, because Jesus in this passage said, remain in me. Some translations say, abide in me. And it's a command. It means stick close to me. It means stay with me. And there's this element of faithfulness here. But the way that this plays out day to day is that we're going to learn to pay attention to Jesus. We will practice awareness. And I think that's part of what he's getting at when he says we're going to abide in him. We're going to be aware in him. Now, there are a lot of places in the Bible that call us to be aware, that call us to keep awake. Notice what's going on around us. There's that moment on the night when Jesus knew that he was going to die, and he goes out to the garden to pray. He takes some of his disciples with him, and he's over there praying his heart out before God. He's sweating drops of blood. And his disciples fail to grasp the intensity and the seriousness of that night. They fall asleep, and he comes back and he says, keep awake so you don't fall into temptation. Or in the book of Revelation, Jesus says to the church in Sardis, he says, wake up. Or in Ephesians, this letter, there's this moment where he says, wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And I remember once I was a kid, we did this high school mission trip. We went to another country, and we did this mission trip. It was a Sunday morning. We were worshiping with this little church, and it was in a language I didn't understand. The pastor was preaching for a long time, and here I am, this high school kid on a mission trip, and I started to nod off. And when I say nod, I mean it's like emphasis on nod. Like I was leaning way, way over, and my friends were afraid I was going to fall into the aisle, right? Like they're putting their hand out, and here I am nodding off, and the pastor that was accompanying us on this trip flips to this verse in Ephesians, and it's like, keep awake, wake up, O sleeper, right? And I don't know if it really worked or not, but keep awake. Well, here's Jesus. He's saying, remain in me. And part of what he's getting at is be awakened to my presence. Be aware of me. Be awake to what I'm doing in your life. He says, here's the thing about joy. You're going to have to be awake to it. It doesn't come from inside of us. We can't make ourselves joyful. We can't force joy. All we can do is wake up to it. Be aware. So what you can do is become sensitized to joy. And part of this is going to happen through regular worship. But day in and day out, it's going to mean becoming aware of what God is doing in us through prayer. Because listen, prayer makes us vulnerable to God. And so when we really pray well, we are opening ourselves up to God. We are pouring ourselves out to him. And that makes us vulnerable to him. And when we are vulnerable to God, then we are vulnerable to joy. Now, I don't know, have you had this experience? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, what I've discovered is that the most joyful people aren't the ones who are always getting their way, right? It's not that everything just goes perfectly for them. The most joyful people, it's not that their lives are nice and easy and only joyful things happen to them. I mean, look, stuff happens, right? Stuff happens, and it happens to all of us, whether we deserve it or not, the good and the bad. But it strikes me that the most joyful people I know are the ones who are open to the possibility of joy. They are the ones who are willing to pay attention, to see beyond whatever difficulty might be going on in their lives at that moment, and pay attention to how joy can show up. Because the bright sorrow of joy often comes bundled with so many other feelings and experiences. And, my experience has been that most of the time, for most of us, joy will show up when we least expect it. Joy's bundled with these other emotions. It just strikes out of the blue. We'll be crying about something. And there will be this moment where joy will just kind of happen. It will just show up in our lives. And can we be awake to that? Because that's what really matters. Are we awake? Are we paying attention? Are we receptive to joy? Are we aware of joy? Because joy will often show up when we least expect it. At least that's been my experience. The other day we had this experience in our house, and one of our sons got sick, and so we rearranged the schedule, and I went to pick him up, and kind of just all the plans got set on hold, and you just rearrange everything, because that's what you do, you're parents, right? And you love your kids, and so we rearranged everything, and got him home, got him taken care of, and then later in the evening, I went out with my other two sons, and I'm walking the stroller, and there's this moment, and it was a beautiful evening, it was really cool, and we're just running an errand. And suddenly I was struck by this sense of deep gratitude, this awareness of joy. And it really kind of caught me by surprise, because for all intents and purposes, I shouldn't have been joyful at that moment. I should have been frustrated, right? And I should have been anxious, knowing that my plans all had to be picked up bright and early in the morning, that there was a whole lot of work that had to happen before the weekend could happen. And so there I was, but just struck by joy that came out of the blue. And maybe it was awareness of the beauty of having these little people in my life. Maybe it was awareness of the beauty of the evening. I don't know. It seemed like it was more than any one thing. It was just a sense of gratitude and a sense of joy. It just kind of struck out of the blue. Maybe you've had that kind of experience. I think that's the question. Can we be aware of joy showing up in our lives? Now, the other thing that Jesus said is in verse 10. He said, if you obey my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have obeyed my Father's commandments and remain in his love. So I think obeying his commandments, living a life that is walking with him, is going to lead to joy. Now, here's what I mean by this. It's not like a prosperity gospel of joy. It's not like do this, then you get this, like a reward, obey commandments, your life will be joyful. I mean, there's a little bit of something to that. If we walk in Jesus' ways, there's going to be a whole lot of things that we will decide not to do, and so we will avoid some pitfalls in life. If we walk in Jesus' ways, there are going to be some possibilities that open up for us that are good possibilities, blessed possibilities. But it's not a kind of an this equals this sort of a thing, right? You can do everything right and still have stuff happen in your life. I think the deeper meaning of what Jesus is getting at here is that obeying his commandments is making choices. It is living with intentionality. We're setting ourselves up intentionally to live a life of joy. So it's saying, I'm going to intentionally live the kind of life that Jesus demonstrated or taught, or at least that's what I'm going to aspire to. I'm going to intentionally live a life of joy. It's saying, I am going to choose to do things that give joy. I'm going to choose to do things that give joy to others. It's saying, I'm going to choose joy. Now, I don't mean that we're going to just choose things that are fun, right? Like, I like to have fun, right? Fun is good. I think we should all have more fun, right? So the pastor said that. We should all have more fun. But it's not just that. I think it's joy. And joy is a little bit different than fun. So we cannot make joy happen. But what we can do is make choices that set us up for joy. So here's what I mean. We can't always choose what happens to us, but we can choose how we respond to those things. So we can choose to respond with kindness to a harsh word. We can choose to care for those who are difficult to relate to. We can choose to reach out to folks who are different from us. We can choose gratitude. We can choose grace. We can choose mercy. we can choose joy. So you can choose, for instance, to turn off that TV or set down the phone and get down on the floor with your child or your grandchild, and assuming you can get back up, and with your niece or your nephew, whoever that is. You can choose to choose to be with them, choose joy, right? You can decide, you know what? My work is going to be done for now, or at least it's going to be done enough. I'm going to go take a walk with someone that's important to me, a person that I love. I'm going to choose to be open to the joy of that relationship. Or, you can choose. You can just say, I'm going to not be anxious right now and just kind of sit here in this pool of anxiety. I'm going to go outside. I'm going to sit down under the stars. I'm just going to say, hey, God, what do you have for me? What's next? What are you up to? I'm going to choose to be present to my Creator. I'm going to choose the joy of going deeper with God. So we can't choose everything in our lives, but I think we can make choices that lead to joy. We can make decisions. We can set priorities. We can decide on what matters for us. And I think so often, tell me if this rings true, I think so often we make choices based on tiredness or ease or resignation or a sense that we have no control over our lives rather than choosing to live with intentionality. I don't know, does that ring true for anybody? And I think so often that life, if we live it that way, life just becomes one thing after another. It just becomes almost this drudgery. It's like sleep, work, eat, sleep, repeat, right? And so we fail to lift our heads up and to make choices that lead to joy. But I believe it's possible to choose joy, and I believe this because I've experienced things like that so many times. I'm often just living the opposite, right? I get caught up in tasks. It's busy, right? Like I feel like I'm always in a hurry, and I hate that. And my life gets reduced to the size of like my computer screen. And for me, what kind of bursts through all of that, what shakes things up, is prayer. So I've got to pray, right? Like that is my secret. I've got to spend time in prayer. That shakes everything up so I don't just become this doer. Once I was in my office, it was the middle of winter, and I was taking some time in prayer, and I was just sitting there, just pouring my heart out to God in prayer. And the boiler inspector came to the church, and he was like, "Where's the boiler?" And I pointed him on his way, and he went and did his thing, and I got back to praying. Boiler inspector finishes his inspection and comes back upstairs, walks by my office, and goes, "So, not much going on today." I said, "Well, depends on what day, right? If you come here on Wednesday night, there's kids all over the place, right? Sunday morning we worship. Today I pray, right? Like that's what I'm doing right now." He goes, "Well, I guess prayer is something." Well, I can tell you that prayer is definitely something. And for me, at least, without prayer, all the rest of life is just stuff, right? Otherwise, I'm just pushing papers, right? At least that's what it feels like. Spending time in prayer is kind of one of those things that I do to interrupt the taskedness of my life, to position myself for joy. It's how I choose joy. And I have to do that. I have to pray. I schedule it in. Honestly, I write it on my to-do list because it requires that kind of intentionality. And part of the reason that prayer works like this and sets me up for joy is because prayer, this is how it is for all of us, prayer gets us in touch with Jesus. And Jesus is the ultimate source of joy. This is what he's talking about in verse 5, where he says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." He's the vine, we're the branches. Jesus is the source of joy. We are not going to be able to find our joy apart from him, not really. We're going to have to keep seeking him. Keep walking with him, keep talking to him. We're going to have to recognize that what we are seeking when we are seeking joy is not a thing, not an experience, not an emotion. What we are really seeking when we seek joy is a person. We're seeking Jesus, the very face of God, and our hearts are always restless until we rest in him. There will be no other person, place, or thing in where we can find joy, not really. Now, as I was preparing for this series on joy, this teaching series, I got a hold of C.S. Lewis's book, Surprised by Joy. That's what I was quoting earlier. And C.S. Lewis, he's this great British writer on faith. He's the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia series. He's got a bunch of other books out there. But C.S. Lewis was not always a believer. And for much of his life, he really didn't have any space for God, and he really describes that journey in this book, Surprised by Joy. And he says that he started off looking for joy. And so I was going to this book hoping that he could give me some pointers on how to find joy. And what surprised me about his book, Surprised by Joy, is that it's not about finding joy. And he gets to the end, and he kind of does this little twist, and he says it's about finding God. He has this winding journey, first seeking joy, and it ends up being this search for Jesus. And this is the thing. Like Lewis, we may think that what we want is joy. We may think that will give our life a sense of depth and purpose, but what we are really being drawn to is Jesus. And we might not understand him. We might not know a single thing about him, but he is real. And he is calling to us, and he's drawn us to him in ways that are appropriate to who we are and where we're at in our lives. And all of us have that capacity to recognize him and to take a step toward him. All of our lives have his fingerprints on them. And I think all of us will discover in the end that there was this breadcrumb trail that was winding through our lives, that was leading us to him. And sometimes we picked up on it, and sometimes we didn't. But our deepest hungers have always been truly a hunger for him. Our deepest longings are actually a longing for him, and we yearn to go home, to a home we didn't even know we had. And that's with him. That's Jesus. And what all of this means is that the joy we seek will only be found insofar as we seek Jesus. We will discover our ultimate joy in Jesus because he designed us that way. And his teachings lead us that way. I think the way of Jesus is the way of joy because it's the way that leads to him. So can we receive that joy? Can we receive him? Well, there's this place in the Gospels where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and the Gospel writers tell us that this moment, his disciples, they're discussing big themes about kind of, who's going to be in charge, right? Who's going to sit at your right hand and your left in the kingdom? And Jesus takes a hold of a little kid, a child, and he puts him in front of the disciples, and he says, listen, everybody, if you're going to receive the kingdom, if you're going to really follow me, you're going to have to do it like this little child. You are going to have to enter the kingdom as a child enters the kingdom. And like everything that Jesus said and did, there were all kinds of meaning wrapped up in that statement. It's pretty full. But I think one thing that Jesus meant is this, that if we're going to learn to come to the kingdom and experience that joy, we're going to have to do it as a child who comes with openness to the simple, everyday, sometimes challenging, yet somehow imperceptible joy of the Lord. That's it.